Emma had always believed in the life she built. She wasn't naive. She knew marriage wasn't perfect. But she had Daniel, and that was enough. Their home wasn't large, just a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. But within those walls, it felt like a family. Daniel was the provider, working long hours to ensure their daughter, Lily, had everything she needed. Meanwhile, Emma took care of the household, raising Lily and looking after Henry, her father-in-law. Henry had once been a strong man. A carpenter by trade, his hands had built countless homes, but a stroke had stolen his independence. Now he was confined to a wheelchair, unable to work, unable to contribute the way he once had. Emma never saw him as a burden. She had grown up watching her own parents take care of their elders, so caring for Henry felt natural. She cooked his meals, helped him move around the house, and listened when he spoke about the past. Stories of a younger Daniel, of mistakes made, of love lost and regained. Some days were harder than others. Daniel worked long hours, leaving before sunrise and coming home late. Some nights, he barely spoke, exhaustion swallowing his words. But Emma believed in the quiet moments, when he kissed Lily's forehead before bed, or when he pulled Emma into a tired embrace. She knew their love was still there. This was the life she had chosen, and she had no regrets, until the day he left. The morning felt no different from any other. The soft glow of dawn peeked through the curtains, and the house was wrapped in its usual quiet stillness. Emma stretched, half expecting to feel Daniel's warmth beside her, but when she reached out, the bed was cold. Frowning, she sat up. Daniel always left early for work, but he usually kissed her goodbye. Maybe today had been an exception. She got out of bed, pulling on her robe, and made her way to the closet to grab clothes for the day. But the moment she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. It was empty. Not entirely. There were a few hangers left, and a stray pair of shoes sat forgotten in the corner. But Daniel's clothes, his suitcase, his belongings, they were gone. Emma's heartbeat thundered in her chest. She spun around, scanning the room, hoping to find some logical explanation. That's when she saw it. A single piece of paper lay on the nightstand. She picked it up with shaking fingers. "I can't do this anymore." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just 7 words that shattered her world. Panic set in. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. Straight to voicemail. She called again and again. Nothing. Her legs felt weak as she stumbled to the kitchen. Henry was already awake, sitting in his wheelchair watching her. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. His eyes, full of sorrow, told her he already knew. Emma opened her mouth, but no words came. Daniel was gone. The first few days after Daniel left were a blur. Emma moved through them in a daze, as if any moment now, she'd wake up and find it had all been a nightmare. But reality didn't wait for grief. The bills kept coming. The fridge grew emptier. And every time Lily asked, "When is Daddy coming home?" Emma had to swallow the lump in her throat and force a smile. Daniel had been the one holding their finances together. His job paid the mortgage, covered the utilities, and put food on the table. Emma had worked part-time at a local diner, but what she earned was barely enough to cover groceries, let alone everything else. She tried to stretch their savings, but it wasn't much. 2 months? Maybe 3. After that, she had no idea how they would survive. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, working late into the night while a neighbor watched Lily. But no matter how hard she worked, the numbers didn't add up. The house, once a place of warmth, started to feel colder, emptier. The leaky faucet in the kitchen dripped constantly, but she couldn't afford to call a plumber. The walls needed repainting, but paint was a luxury. The heater sputtered in the middle of the night and Henry would cough in his room, but she had to choose between fixing it or keeping the electricity on. Even food became a struggle. She learned to make cheap meals stretch: rice, beans, soup made from whatever she could find on sale. She ate less so Lily and Henry wouldn't have to. She never complained. Not once. But every night when Lily was asleep and Henry had retired to his room, Emma would sit at the kitchen table, head in her hands, wondering how much longer she could hold on. Whispers followed Emma wherever she went. The neighborhood, once a place of casual greetings and friendly smiles, had turned into something else, a place of pitying glances and quiet judgments. At the grocery store, women would lower their voices when she walked past, but she still caught fragments of their conversations. Poor thing, raising a child alone. No surprise he left. Maybe she wasn't a good wife. She should find another man, someone to take care of her. Emma ignored them. She had to. If she let their words sink in, she would break, and she couldn't afford to break. Some people weren't as subtle. Mrs. Green, an elderly woman down the street, pulled her aside one afternoon. "Emma, dear, you're still young. A woman like you shouldn't be struggling alone. Men don't stay where they aren't happy. Maybe it's time to move on." Emma forced a polite smile, but inside, anger burned beneath her exhaustion. Did they think she didn't hurt? That she hadn't given Daniel everything? She didn't need another man. She needed stability. She needed to be strong for Lily. She needed time to breathe. At home, Henry watched her carefully. He never said much, but Emma saw the guilt in his eyes. One evening, as she set his dinner in front of him, he hesitated before speaking. "Emma, if I weren't here, things would be easier for you." She froze. "Don't say that." Henry sighed, looking down at his trembling hands. "I see how hard you work. I see how people talk. If I weren't holding you back, you could stop." Her voice was firm. "You are not a burden, Henry." Tears gathered in his eyes. "Daniel left. You didn't. That makes all the difference." That night, when Emma lay in bed, she let herself cry. Not because of what people said, but because deep down, she was afraid Henry believed them. The house was silent. Lily had finally fallen asleep, her tiny breaths steady and soft. Henry had gone to bed hours ago. Outside, the wind rattled the old window frames, and the dim kitchen light cast long shadows across the floor. Emma sat at the table, staring at the unopened bills stacked in front of her. Rent was due in a week. The electricity bill was past due. The fridge was nearly empty. She pressed her hands against her face, her body trembling. She couldn't do this anymore. She had tried. God, she had tried. She had worked until her feet ached, until her hands were raw from scrubbing dishes at the diner. She had stretched every dollar, cut corners where she could. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent and hot. She covered her mouth to muffle the sound, not wanting Lily or Henry to hear. She didn't want them to know how close she was to breaking. But someone heard. In the dim hallway, Henry sat in his wheelchair, watching her from the shadows. He had woken up to use the bathroom, but when he passed the kitchen, he saw her, his daughter-in-law, the woman who had carried everything on her shoulders, now crumbling under the weight of it all. He wanted to say something. He wanted to comfort her. But what could he say? "I'm sorry I can't help you? I'm sorry my son abandoned you?" He gripped the wheels of his chair tightly, his jaw clenched. He had never felt so useless in his life. Emma let out a shaky breath and wiped her face. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Tomorrow, she would wake up, put on a smile for Lily, and keep going, because she had no other choice. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, exhausted. The day had drained every bit of energy she had left. The long hours at the diner, the weight of unpaid bills, and the constant worry about Lily's future, all of it pressed down on her like an invisible burden she could never set aside. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors as the wind rattled the old windows. The air was cool, and the dim light from her bedside lamp cast soft shadows across the room. Then came a knock. It was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. Emma frowned, glancing at the clock. Almost midnight. She stood and crossed the room, opening the door to find Henry, sitting in his wheelchair just outside. His hands trembled slightly as they rested in his lap, and when he lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes were heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Sorrow, maybe, or regret. "Henry, is everything okay?" The old man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he cleared his throat. His voice, usually steady even in the hardest times, was rough, as if the words he was about to say physically pained him. "Emma, you need to go." Emma blinked. "Go? Go where?" she asked, confused. Henry let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening against the arms of his wheelchair. "Away from here. Find a better life. Get remarried. You're still young, Emma. You don't have to stay and suffer like this. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard him, but the look in Henry's eyes, raw, filled with something close to desperation, told her otherwise. "Henry," she whispered, shaking her head. "What are you talking about?" Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. He was serious. "I see the way you struggle," he said, voice lower now. "You work yourself to the bone, and for what? To keep an old man alive? I should be the one taking care of you, not the other way around." Emma took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're not a burden, Henry." He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "That's exactly what I am," he snapped. "If I weren't here, you could have a real life, a future. You wouldn't have to scrape by every single day." Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "And what? You think if I leave, everything suddenly gets better?" Her voice rose slightly, but she didn't care. "You think I can just walk away from the only family I have left?" Henry's shoulders slumped. For the first time since Daniel left, he looked defeated. "Emma, I love you like my own daughter. That's why I need you to go. I don't want you to waste your life taking care of me. It's not fair to you." Emma felt something inside her snap. "Fair?" she repeated, her voice cracking. "None of this is fair. Daniel leaving wasn't fair. Struggling to survive every day isn't fair. But you, Henry, you're not the problem. You're my family." Henry shook his head. "I don't want to see you like this anymore, Emma. I don't want to be the reason you're stuck." Silence filled the room. Emma's chest ached. She had spent so long trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together, that she never once considered the possibility that Henry was carrying his own guilt. She thought he had been the one leaning on her. But now she realized he had been carrying his own weight all along. And he was tired. She took a slow, shuddering breath and knelt down beside him, reaching for his hands. "Henry, please look at me." He hesitated before lifting his gaze. "You are not a burden," she whispered, squeezing his hands tightly. "You are my family. I don't care if it's hard. I don't care if people think I should leave. I won't. Because I love you, and I won't let you give up on yourself." Henry's lips. For the first time in years, he let himself cry. Emma knelt in front of Henry, her hands reaching for his. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of hard labor, hands that had once built a life for his family, but now trembled with age and helplessness. His words still echoed in her mind. "Go, find a better life, leave me behind." Tears burned in her eyes, but she shook her head, gripping his hands tighter. "No, Henry, I can't leave you. You are my family." Henry swallowed hard, his face tightening as if he was trying to hold back years of guilt, regret, and sorrow. "Emma, I see how hard you work. I see the exhaustion in your eyes. If I weren't here, you wouldn't have to struggle like this. You could start over." Emma's chest ached. "I don't need to start over. I need my family, and you, Henry, are my family." For the first time in years, Henry's strong exterior cracked. His lips trembled, his shoulders shook, a single tear slipped down his cheek, something Emma had never seen before. "I should be the one protecting you," he whispered. "But instead, I'm the reason you suffer." Emma squeezed his hands, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't leave, Henry. You stayed. That means more than you know." He let out a shuddering breath, nodding as if finally allowing himself to believe her words. That night, for the first time since Daniel left, neither of them felt completely alone. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the old heater in the corner. Emma and Henry sat there, their hands still clasped together, neither of them speaking. There was nothing left to say. And yet, everything had changed. Before tonight, Henry had seen himself as a burden. He had convinced himself that Emma stayed only out of obligation, that she was sacrificing her happiness for a man who no longer had anything to offer. But now, as he looked at her, this young woman who had every reason to walk away but refused, he realized something he had been too blind to see. She wasn't staying because she had to. She was staying because she wanted to. For the first time since his stroke, he didn't feel useless. He felt needed. He felt like family. Emma exhaled slowly, her shoulders finally relaxing. She had spent so long carrying the weight of this house, of this family, that she had forgotten she wasn't alone. Henry was here, and that mattered. They sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, both lost in their own thoughts. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Eventually, Emma stood up, squeezing Henry's shoulder gently. "Let's go to bed, Dad. We have another long day tomorrow." Henry looked up at her, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. "Yes, we do." And from that moment on, they were no longer two people struggling under the same roof. They were a family. Emma knew that love alone wouldn't keep the lights on or put food on the table. No matter how much she wanted to believe things would get better, she had to make them better. The next morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't going to let this life break her. She started looking for extra work, scanning job listings, making calls, asking around. The diner where she worked couldn't offer her more shifts, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. Within a week, she found a second job at a convenience store, working the late shift after finishing her evening shift at the diner. It wasn't ideal. The pay was low and the hours were brutal, but it was something. It was a step forward. The first few weeks were exhausting. She barely slept. She would come home from the diner, tuck Lily into bed, then head straight to the convenience store, working until dawn. By the time she got home, she had just enough time to close her eyes for an hour before waking Lily for school. Her body ached, her feet throbbed, but every paycheck she brought home reminded her why she was doing this. Henry, despite his condition, refused to sit idly by. "Let me help," he had said one night when Emma was preparing to leave for work. She had been hesitant at first. Henry struggled to move around on his own, and she worried about leaving him alone with Lily. But he insisted. "I may not be able to do much, but I can be here for Lily. She needs someone while you're out working." So he became her rock at home. He helped Lily with her homework. He told her bedtime stories. He made sure she ate her meals, even if all he could do was guide her from his wheelchair. And for the first time since Daniel left, Emma didn't feel like she was doing this alone. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something new. Emma never thought stability would come in small victories, but now she learned to celebrate them. The bills were still there, the work was still exhausting, but she was making it. She no longer had to count every dollar before buying groceries. She could finally afford fresh fruit for Lily instead of canned food. The lights stayed on, the rent was paid on time, and for the first time in months, she could breathe. Life was still far from easy, but the constant panic, the unbearable weight of uncertainty, it wasn't as crushing as before. Henry saw the change in her. One evening, as Emma sat at the kitchen table sorting through the month's expenses, Henry wheeled himself closer. "You did this, Emma." She looked up. "I wouldn't have made it without you, Henry." But he shook his head. "No, you did this. You fought for this family when no one else would." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. Henry, the man who once sat in silent guilt, now looked at her with something different. Pride. "I used to think I was holding you back," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But now I see it. You never saw me as a burden. You saw me as family." Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Because you are, Henry." For the first time in years, Henry believed it. And for the first time since Daniel left, Emma finally felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was moving forward. Emma had spent so much of her life believing that she needed someone to hold her up. First her husband, then the stability of a two-parent home. She had grown up thinking that life was easier with a man by her side, someone to share the burden. But now, she knew the truth. She had built this life on her own. She had survived the heartbreak, the judgment, the exhaustion, and still, she stood strong. She didn't need saving. She was her own savior. There were days when loneliness crept in, nights when she missed the comfort of having someone beside her. But when she looked at her daughter, when she saw the warmth and security she had built for Lily, she knew that was enough. And Henry, he had changed too. The man who once hid in the corners of the house, convinced he was nothing more than a weight dragging Emma down, was gone. Now, Henry belonged. He no longer apologized for existing. Instead, he played a role in their family. He helped Lily with school. He made grocery lists. He learned new ways to contribute, whether it was guiding Emma through home repairs or simply being someone she could talk to after a long day. "You're more than enough, Henry," Emma told him one evening. "You always were." And for the first time, he believed it. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were whole. The morning sunlight poured through the worn curtains, casting a golden glow across the living room. Emma stood in the doorway, a warm cup of coffee in her hands, watching a scene she never thought she'd cherish so much. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, laughing as she held up her crayon drawing, showing it off to Henry. "What do you think, Grandpa?" she asked eagerly. Henry adjusted his glasses, pretending to inspect the picture with great seriousness. "I think this might be the best drawing I've ever seen," he said, his voice full of playful admiration. Lily beamed, scooting closer to show him the details. Emma smiled to herself. This was home, not the house, not the things they owned or the money in her bank account. It was this moment, this feeling. A year ago, she had been drowning, trapped in fear, in loss, in the weight of everything Daniel had left behind. She had wondered if she could ever rebuild. Now, she knew the answer. There would still be challenges. There would still be bills, hard days, and moments where she wished things had turned out differently. But she wasn't alone. She had Henry. She had Lily. She had a family. And for the first time in a long time, Emma wasn't afraid of the future. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of loyalty, love, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Join us as we share stories that remind us of what truly matters in life. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment.